Passage 1 is adapted from Suchan Christine Lim, Singapore Literature, a Moral Force to be Reckoned with. Passage 2 is adapted from Lauren Elkin, National Literature and International Question. Passage 1, a nation's literature is the mirror through which people see themselves. Children and adults need to see themselves in their country's fiction and poetry. Louis Anne Yamanaka, the Pushcart Prize-winning poet and author of the book Name Me Nobody, said, "Until you see yourself in literature, in the written word, you don't exist." This is why every national school curriculum includes the study of its nation's literary works. Reading the literature of a country is like listening to its heartbeat. One hears the hopes, fears, and angst of ordinary folks like you and me. At the universal level, literature is the bridge built by imagination to help us cross over into the interior landscape of those who are different from us and yet the same, and as extraordinary and odd as ourselves. The writer's focus provides readers with insights into their society, to express the unexpressed, to say the unsaid, to give voice to those with no voice. This has always been one of literature's many contributions. In literature, king or beggar, prime minister or dialect-speaking squatter, all are equal, all can take center stage as the main character. No other school subject focuses on the individual or marginalized in the way literature does. This in itself is a moral force in a world in which numbers count and wealth, power, and intellect dominate. Singapore literature has something to offer us and the world. It is neither monocultural nor monolingual. Comprising the poetry and fiction of 4 official languages, Singapore literature writes across language and culture. The congregation of English and Asian voices is part of our national fabric and identity as a people. The Singapore novelist writing in English accepts the challenge of recreating and rendering the variety of Asian voices and languages into English. Our literary fiction, poetry, and plays offer the reader multiple perspectives and individual narratives that question, challenge, and broaden our views of ourselves beyond the national Singapore story and the officially sanctioned founding myth. In the long run, while geography and politics continue to shape our nation, our literature will reveal our collective soul. Okay, so question 10 is about passage 2, which is odd because normally the first question is from passage 1. Line 44, right? Yeah, so it is passage 2. So we'll come to this question later. Which choice from passage 1 best support Lim's idea that a country's literature can affect individuals' perceptions of who they are? Okay, so lines 2 to 4, a nation's poetry, and 11 to 12, reading heartbeat. 2 to 4, a nation's poetry, and 11, reading and heartbeat. Okay. Then you have 13 to 17, at the ourselves, 22, 24, in literature, character. 13 at the ourselves and 22 to 24 in literature and character. Okay. So the question that we are trying to answer is that which choice supports the idea that a country's literature can affect individuals' perception of who they are? So option A, a nation's literature is the mirror through which people see themselves. Children and adults need to see themselves in their country's fiction and poetry. Reading the literature of a country is like listening to its heartbeat. At the universal level, literature is the bridge built by the imagination to help us cross over into the interior landscape of those who are different from us and yet the same and as extraordinary and odd as ourselves. In literature, king or beggar, prime minister or dialect-speaking squatter, all are equal, all can take center stage as the main character. So this would be option A, right? Because when it says that the literature of a nation is the mirror through which people see themselves, then that means that the literature of a nation shapes people's perceptions of themselves. Children and adults need to see themselves, right? So that's how their perception is shaped. Option B talks about understanding the heartbeat of a nation, understanding the very core of a nation. So this is not about people's perception of themselves. Option C is about understanding other cultures. So that is not what we are looking for. And option D is about how anybody can be the central character. That is, that literature does not discriminate between the rich or the poor or the gifted and the ungifted. So that also is not what we are looking for. So option A. Okay. What is the main effect of the phrase to express the unexpressed, to say the unsaid, to give voice to those with no voice? Lines 19 to 20. So this comes here. The writer's focus provides readers with insights into their society, to express the unexpressed, to say the unsaid, to give voice to those with no voice. This has always been one of literature's many contributions. To highlight the defining characteristics of high quality national literature, to emphasize the unique potential that national literature has to champion the oppressed, to convince readers of the importance of national literature in the civic education of all citizens, and to encourage writers who focus on national literature to include characters of diverse backgrounds. So this is option B, right? Because the author is describing the role of literature as unique in the sense that it can give voice to the oppressed, right? Which is what option B is saying. This is not about producing high quality national literature, right? That's not the main point of speaking of how literature gives voice to those with no voice. So it's not A. It's not about the civic education of all citizens. That's not the purpose of giving voice to the oppressed. And it's not about encouraging writers to create characters of diverse backgrounds, right? So B. As used in line 51. So I think line 51 was in the second passage. What about other questions? Yeah, so we will have to read the second passage now. As a nation, we have no literature. The literary critic Belinsky cries in despair in part one of Tom Stoppard's play, The Coast of Utopia, lamenting the influence of European writers on Russian writers and stressing the importance of creating a national story of their own. With storytelling comes a sense of identity, but national literatures evolve in stages, and the need for a literature of one's own changes according to the political situation of the nation in question. A new nation or a nation struggling to declare its independence will be driven to create something that is theirs, a literature that tells their national story. But the flux of modern history makes this a more or less impossible task. The universal idea speaks through humanity itself and differently through each nation in each stage of its history, Belinsky says later in the same speech. The need for a national literature changes according to the moment the nation is experiencing, and Stoppard catches this exactly. On one hand, the ardent yearning for one, and on the other, the contingency of the literature on the historical moment. At the recent Festival America in Paris, the question of a writer's nationality and ethnic identity preoccupied most of the discussions. Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, the Nigerian-born author of Half of a Yellow Sun, argued for Nigerian literature to be taught in Nigerian schools. It's a paradox, she said. People can be considered educated while knowing nothing about our history. They read English books, not Nigerian books. What this means is we really don't have a sense of our own history. Such history, she said, could not be written by outsiders. The stories of Africa should be written by Africans. Okay, so the first question was question 10. In passage 2, the quotation from the character Belinsky in line 44 primarily serves to. So this is, as a nation, we have no literature, right? This is the quotation that the critic Belinsky speaks in despair in part one of the play, right? Okay. So this serves to characterize writers who focus on national literature as overly dramatic and emotional about the subject, provide a counterpoint to the opinions of the writer Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, who is also quoted in the passage, illustrate Elkin's claim about historical change with a specific example from a creative work, represent the frustrations of people who desire the development of a literature unique to their culture. So if you try and break down what is happening in this passage, so Elkin starts by presenting this quotation from Belinsky, who is a character in Tom Stoppard's play. And he laments the influence of European writers on Russian writers and stresses the need for creating a national story of their own, right? And then Elkin talks about how a national story is not a fixed project, it's a fluid thing, right? Because the need for a literature of one's own changes according to the political situation, right? And then Belinsky comes again that the universal idea speaks through humanity itself and differently through each nation in each stage of its history. So Belinsky kind of understands, right? Even though Belinsky is a character, he supports the point that Elkin, the author of the second passage, is making, in that it's not possible to have one structured national literature because that's a fluid idea, right? Okay, and then we talk about Adichie and how she speaks about creating a national literature which is grounded in the community, in the local area. So I think the answer for this would be D, right? Because this kind of brings out the frustrations of those who want to have a literature unique to their culture, which is then expanded upon by Elkin, who says that this idea is not as simple as it might look, right? The purpose is not to characterize writers who focus on national literature as dramatic and emotional. In fact, Elkin does give due respect to this idea and approaches it and broadens it. This is not a counterpoint to what Adichie is saying, because Adichie is kind of also saying that there is a desire for a literature that emerges from within the community, within society. And this does not illustrate Elkin's claim about historical change with an example, right? The example is not really expressing what Elkin is trying to say. The example is actually presenting the other side of Elkin's argument, and then Elkin kind of develops it. So it's D. As used in line 51, stages most nearly means. So 51. Okay, but national literature evolves in stages, and the need for a literature of one's own changes according to the political situation of the nation in question. Okay, so it evolves in phases, right? Literature evolves in phases. It evolves in different periods. So stages would be best represented by phases. Platform would not be suitable here because a platform would have a more physical meaning, while here we are talking about time period. So it's not A. Arenas will also be a more physical word, similar to a platform or like a big space, so it doesn't fit here. And levels does not convey time with as much accuracy as phases does, right? So when we talk about stages, we are not speaking of levels, which are generally thought of as vertical, established in a hierarchy, but as time period, which is mostly horizontal, right? So B. Which choice best describes Elkin's perspective as expressed in passage 2 on people's desire for their own national literature? She appreciates that they want to establish an impressive account of their nation's history, but she notes that this might lead them to discourage the inclusion of regrettable historical events in their national literature. She sympathizes with their concern that writing from other nations can taint the development of a new nation's literature, while observing that all literature eventually becomes irrelevant as a result of historical shifts. She understands that the desire for a national literature changes according to the historical situation, which makes capturing the spirit of a nation in the form of literature challenging. She challenges the isolated nature of national literature and instead encourages people to read across cultures. Okay, so I'll just add that, across cultures. So this should be C, right? Very clearly, Elkin says that, she understands that there is a desire for national literature, and also that it is not easy to sate this desire because national literature as an idea is fluid and it changes according to the historical moment. So that is what C is saying, that it changes according to the historical situation, which is why capturing the spirit of a nation is challenging. Okay, in option A, I don't think she talks about the inclusion of regrettable historical events and why people wouldn't want that because they want to establish an impressive account. So that is not brought up. I think she does talk about how writing from other nations' perspective can taint the development of a nation's literature. But I don't think that's the main point. That's only brought up when Adichie's quotation is included towards the end. I also think that this is extreme, right? I don't think she would say that all national literature becomes irrelevant because of historical shifts. The better way to say it is that it's challenging to write a national literature, which is what option C does. And I don't think she talks about how national literature is isolated and so people should read across cultures. So C. Which choice provides the best evidence to the answer to the previous question? 44, 49 as a nation owned and 50 with identity. 44, 49 as a nation owned, 50 with identity. Okay. Then 61, 66, the need moment, 76, 78, such declared. 61 to 66, the need moment, and 76 to such and declared. Okay. So as a nation, we have no literature. The literary critic Belinsky cries and stresses the importance. Okay, so this is just presenting one half of the right answer, that, there is a desire. With storytelling comes a sense of identity. Okay. The need for a national literature changes according to the moment the nation is experiencing. And Stoppard catches this exactly. On the one hand, the ardent yearning for one, and on the other, the contingency of the literature on the historical moment. So this is the right answer, because option C, we spoke about how there is this tension between capturing a national literature, the desire to do that, and the fact that it's not easy to do so because the very idea is fluid. So C should be a good answer. And such history could not be written by outsiders. Yes, so this is true. As we said, this is definitely there, but that is not the evidence for the main argument that that Elkin is making, because the main argument is that, it's not easy to write national literature. So C. Okay. According to passage 2, Adichie and others at Festival America were specially concerned with issues common to American writers living abroad, changes in recent history and their impact on national literature, the role of literature in encouraging positive relationships among cultures, writers' national and ethnic identities. So this is D. This is directly given here, that the question of a writer's nationality and ethnic identity preoccupied most of the discussions. So this is directly given. It's not about issues common to American writers. The discussion at the festival was not about changes in recent history impacting national literature, and it was not about positive relationships, right? Which choice best describes the main difference between the overall structure and approach of passage 1 compared with passage 2? Passage 1 proposes a nuanced theory for the emergence of national literature in Singapore, while passage 2 provides a light-hearted personal reflection on the topic of national literature. Passage 1 is a sweeping narrative of the history of Singaporean literature, while passage 2 is a detailed report of different writers' perspectives on national literature. Passage 1 presents a zealous defense of the need for national literature, while passage 2 offers an impartial description of the general characteristics of national literature. Passage 1 is a celebration of national literature in general and Singaporean literature in particular, whereas passage 2 is an exploration of tensions within the concept of national literature. So I like D, right? D is a succinct and accurate summary of what the two passages are about. We notice that the first passage celebrates the idea of national literature, and particularly with regard to Singaporean literature, it says that Singaporean literature is a microcosm of Singaporean society. It's diverse, it captures multiple languages, multiple cultures. So that's a celebration. While passage 2 talks about the tension inherent in the very idea of national literature. So D is good. So my problem with option A is this light-hearted personal reflection. I don't think it's light-hearted or personal, so I don't like that part. I'm okay with a discussion of the national literature in Singapore for the first passage. I'm not sure it does look into the emergence of that literature. I think it's got more to do with how the literature is today. So yeah, so A is not right. Okay, in option B, is not correct because there is no detailed report of different writers' perspectives, right? I know that Stoppard and Adichie are mentioned, but the focus is on Elkin developing her own argument through those voices, right? So it's not a report of different writers' perspective. And I think sweeping narrative is somewhat exaggerated. I think it's got more to do with defining the state of Singaporean literature as it is today. Okay, and here why option C is not a good answer is because D is a better answer. Because I don't think it's so much about being impartial as about capturing the tension inherent to national literature, right? While zealous defense is good. So I'm okay with this, but this I think is better captured in option D. Based on the passages, both Lim and Elkin would most likely agree that national literature exists primarily to chronicle the significant events and leaders in a nation's history, reflect the identities and experiences of a nation's people and connect them to one another, accurately portray the culture of a nation to readers from other nations, prove to already established nations that a new nation is legitimately independent. So C and D can be directly eliminated because none of those are brought up by Elkin in the second passage. Now, I think Elkin has interested more, if you go back and read what Elkin is talking about. Right, so it is about the drive to create something that is theirs, a literature that tells their national story, right? So it's about the idea of people wanting to express themselves, right? Which is also kind of brought up in the first passage where the author talks about one hears the hopes, fears, and angst of ordinary folks. So it's not so much to do with the political situation and the leaders, right? It's not so much to do with significant events and leaders. It's more to reflect on the identities and experiences of a nation's people, right? So B. Based on passage 1, Lim would most likely respond to Adichie's argument in passage 2 that Nigerian literature should be taught in Nigerian schools by agreeing that a nation's literature is essential to include in its classroom teaching, asserting that Singaporean literature is more diverse than Nigerian literature and therefore a better choice for teaching young people, arguing that national literature has little to do with learning about a nation's history, extending Adichie's point to say that a nation's school should exclusively teach literature from that nation. Okay, so again, we can cancel out B and C because I don't think Lim would say that Singaporean literature is more diverse and so Nigerian students should study Singaporean literature, or C, because C is absolutely opposite to what Lim is arguing. Now, I just wanted to say, so if you go back and read this part, yeah, so see, it says here, no other school subject focuses on the individual or marginalized in the way literature does. That in itself is a moral force, right? So she does kind of talk about the importance of, yeah, every national school curriculum includes the study of its nation's literary works. So I am leaning towards D. I'm just trying to see if A can be eliminated. Yeah, so I don't think D is good because of the word exclusively, right? I don't think Lim is saying that exclusively teach literature from your nation. Yeah, while A is a good answer, that it is essential to include it in its classroom teaching. And of course, you can have literatures from other nations. So A. Okay, let's grade this. Question 10. D, A, double B, C. D, A, B, B, C. Okay, and 15 to 19. 15 CDDBA. CDDBA. Okay, great. So we got all correct.